Hi, everyone. Oh, okay, this is really loud. My name is Kylie, and this is Abby, and this year we've had the honor to, welcome to the 4th annual undergraduate planned lecture. You know us. We've had the honor to mentor these undergraduates for the last 9 months, so we tend to do a lot of stuff, and I messed up my paragraph.
The lecture has been entirely planned from start to finish by members of the Kinder Institute Democracy Lab. Our team began meeting back in September, researching professors and ultimately selecting Dr. Beatty as, I'm so sorry, we just talked about this, as this year's speaker. This committee has worked diligently to organize today's events, including a special luncheon this afternoon with other Democracy Lab members.
It's been an incredible experience guiding these Democracy Lab members throughout the year, getting to know them, learning from them, and serving as mentors along the way. At this time, I'd like to the members of the undergraduate committee to stand real quick. You'll see them. You'll see them throughout the lecture. They'll be introducing, running the Q&A, and then doing our closing statements. So you'll see them.
So our members are Maddie Geiler, just wave, Maddie Milena, and Campbell James, our committee chair, who will have the honor of introducing our special guest.
Okay, here you go.
All right, thank everybody for coming up to the 4th floor on this beautiful sunny day. It is great to see so many people who are excited to hear from our wonderful guest lecturer, and I am equally excited to introduce her, so let's get started. First, a quick thanks to the Maddies, because we have 2 of them, so, you know. For their work planning, setting up, and organizing today's services. Thank you to Kinder staff, Amber Helwig-Strong, Karen Grinch, Billy Coleman, and our PhD student, Michael Limmer. And finally, Kylie and Abby for guiding and mentoring Maddie and I with this lecture and spending the day with us. They ran off. Oh, I see her. Okay, I'm just blind, I guess. Throughout the day, students have had the privilege of getting to know Dr. Beatty during the tour and lunch. She has been incredibly helpful answering questions about being in the academic community and has been very interested in everything we do here in Kinder, which has only made the students more eager to hear from her. Dr. Jacqueline Beatty is an associate professor of history at York College of Pennsylvania. She received her bachelor's degree in history from Boston College, earned a master's degree in early American history and women and genders history from Villanova University, and completed her PhD in early American history and women's and gender history from George Mason University. Dr. Beatty is the author of Independence, Women in the Patriarchal State in Revolutionary America, published by NYU Press in 2023, and is an expert on the experiences and power of women in the American Revolution. Beyond her book, Dr. Beatty currently has an article forthcoming in the Journal of the Early Republic on rethinking the gender and politics in the early republic, and has contributed chapters to 2 important edited collections, The Gendered Republic, edited by Craig Thompson Friend and Lori Glover, and I lost my spot, 1 second, and Women Waging War in the American Revolution, edited by Holly Mer, both published by or forthcoming with the University of Virginia Press. In addition, Dr. Beatty has published op-eds in Time Magazine and the Washington Post, and has been quoted in Vogue and the NBC News, and is a public historian who regularly consults for revolutionary spaces in Boston. At York College, she teaches a variety of courses, including gender and history, the era of the American Revolution, and public history courses, including podcasting the past and digital public history. And now, in the middle of Women's History Month, she is here to tell us all about reclaiming women's power in the early American Revolution. So please give a warm welcome to Jacqueline Beatty.
Okay. Is my mic good? Am I good? I think it's on. Okay, great. I want to thank you all for being here on a Friday afternoon. I'm astounded to see people sitting on the floor when it's really beautiful out in the middle of March, so I'm very flattered. And to everyone in the overflow room and watching on streaming. So I want to start my talk today by introducing a woman who has long been central in my educational and professional life, Elizabeth Graham Ferguson. Elizabeth Graham lived both in Philadelphia and Horsham, Pennsylvania, the latter a rural area about 15 miles from the city, 15 miles as the crow flies. She herself came to be known as being among the most learned of 18th century American women and a poet of some note. She was well known among elite society for hosting salons in her Graham Park home, fulfilling the domestic role vacated by her mother after Anne's death in 1765. These so-called attic evenings attracted some of Philadelphia's most influential elite. It was at one of these such events on December 7th, 1771, a date infamous at this time as well, because the city's most prominent doctor, Benjamin Rush, brought a young man named Henry Hugh Ferguson to Graham Park with him. By most accounts, observers noticed an immediate attraction between the two. But Henry, who was a recent Scottish immigrant and a penniless one, 12 years Elizabeth's junior, was perhaps, needless to say, not Thomas Graham's first choice of spouse for his daughter. Nevertheless, Elizabeth and Henry married clandestinely in April of 1772, and the two maintained this secret for months. On the day in which Elizabeth had finally worked up the courage to tell her father about the nuptials, he suffered a heart attack and died while walking the grounds of their Graham Park property. She wrote of this incident to a friend, explaining that as she watched her father walk toward the house from her window, she resolved to tell him about her union with Ferguson, but as he got closer, he had fallen to the ground and died before she was ever able to share the news with him. So I share this story not because of its devastating and rather melodramatic nature, but because of the complex legal, political, and marital morass it set in motion. In the 18th century, Anglo-American society followed English common law practices. Pertaining to women, Sir William Blackstone wrote in his Commentaries on the Laws of England that at the time of her marriage, a woman became femme couverte, or a covered woman, under the protection and influence of her husband. As a result, she was to, quote, depend almost all the legal rights, duties, and disabilities that either of them acquire by the marriage on her husband. Blackstone acknowledged that these disabilities, which the wife lies under, are, for the most part, intended for her protection and benefit. He even went so far as to describe women's legal situation as making them a, quote, favorite of the laws of England. This system, known as coverture, expected women's legal and financial submission to men, and in exchange, a husband was bound to provide his wife with the necessaries by law as much as himself, for he has adopted her and her circumstances together. While women's dependent status was well defined under the law, it also permeated Anglo-American society and culture in the Revolutionary era in the form of conduct literature. Pamphlets, novels, magazines, essays, and poems all established separate standards of behavior for women and men, especially in regard to their marital roles. The good wife, for example, was charged with the task of upholding the solemn contract of marriage by remaining, and I quote, virtuous, constant, and faithful to her husband, chaste, pure, and unblemished in every thought, word, and deed. No big deal, right? Totally easy. She was to be submissive to her husband's authority, and she was to desire and strive to obey him by her own inclination. Women, though, were not the only ones called to perform certain standards of comportment in this mutual relationship. Just as wives owed a certain amount of deference to their husband's authority, so too were husbands expected to behave in a certain way. Men were specifically entrusted with the duty of providing financially for their wives, protecting women under their covered status. Ultimately, women remained legally, economically, socially, and culturally dependent on men. So, Thomas Graham's death had very real consequences in Elizabeth's life. Upon her marriage to Henry, Elizabeth became femme couverte, her independent legal identity subsumed by that of her new husband. Any property or money she stood to inherit, rather substantial in this case, would by default instead belong to her husband. Had Thomas Graham been informed of his daughter's intention to marry the penniless young Scot, he could have arranged for legal provisions that would have kept his property from Henry, putting it in a trust of sorts for Elizabeth to control and inherit independent of her husband. Such marriage settlements were not common in early American history, but were possible and regularly employed by the wealthiest in these societies. The trouble was, of course, that Thomas died before he ever knew about his daughter's marriage. And even worse, as Henry utilized his newfound social prominence, traveling across the Atlantic and spending time in Britain, a war broke out between the crown and its colonies in North America. And during his stay in England in 1775, Elizabeth wrote to her husband advising him to remain there amid the violence and turmoil at home, and he did so until 1777. When he did return to the colonies, or to the United States, depending on your political persuasion, he came with Sir William Howe, the commander of the British forces, while declaring his loyalty openly to Great Britain. Philadelphia was occupied by British troops at the time, and Elizabeth was already apprehensive about crossing into occupied territory from Horsham to meet them. Henry later used her as an intermediary sent to implore George Washington, then commander of the Continental Army, to renounce independence and surrender to General Howe. Similarly, Henry and his brother Adam Ferguson attempted to convince Elizabeth to orchestrate a bribery scheme to undermine the Continental Army. Both of these episodes would cause significant political problems for Elizabeth and damage her reputation. The British occupation of Philadelphia ended in June of 1777. A few months prior to that, the Confiscation Act gave the revolutionary government the power to claim all property from those who maintained their loyalty to the crown. Likewise, offenders could be banished from the state and in certain cases hanged for treason. Henry was adjudged to be a traitor in October of 1778. His property, including that which Elizabeth inherited after her father's death, was confiscated by the state of Pennsylvania. Henry had already left Philadelphia with Howe earlier that year. He first resided in New York, briefly meeting with his wife in New Jersey in 1779. Immediately after this reunion, Henry sailed for Boston, from which point he returned to England. Despite several attempts on Henry's part to convince his wife to join him in Britain, and on a few occasions requests for money, Elizabeth never obliged. She remained in Pennsylvania for the rest of her life, and the two never saw each other again. Her marriage effectively, if not legally, ended. Elizabeth sought to regain her family's estate, her inheritance, by petitioning Pennsylvania's Revolutionary-era state government. For several years, she sought a redress for the crises she experienced, working with her connections in Philadelphia society and leaning on friends for financial support and oftentimes for a place to stay. After a years-long back and forth with Pennsylvania's Supreme Executive Council, she submitted her plea in 1781. At issue was the state of Pennsylvania's impending sale of Graham Park, her late father's property in Horsham. So I'd like to take a brief break in Elizabeth's story here to talk about the process of petitioning, which was very different, I think, than what we're used to today in the 21st century. Petitioning in the 18th century was a legal right of subjects of the British Crown and later of citizens of the United States, and an especially potent tool for legal dependence. The petition was both a personal and a political outlet that allowed supplicants to request or even demand certain things from the state. The number of petitions rose significantly during times of crisis, perhaps unsurprisingly, and this includes during the American Revolution. Colonists petitioned both the British Empire and their local and revolutionary state governments, along with the Continental Congress during and after the conflict. Many scholars have studied these sources, and most pay close attention to the ways in which page is stuck. The ways in which they provide opportunities for marginalized people like women to enter into the public political sphere. What I found in my research, however, was that these petitions revealed the inherent and deeply rooted influence of the discourse of dependence on Revolutionary-era women's lives. Women often filled their petitions with language that really reaffirmed their socially and culturally presumed positions of dependence on men. They emphasize tropes of feminine helplessness and vulnerability, including, for example, financial incompetence, ignorance of the law, and dependence on their husbands to bolster their cases. While the rhetoric and narratives that permeate these petitions appear reflexive and perhaps a kind of formality, I joke that they're sometimes kind of like Mad Libs where you just fill in the blank, here's my problem, here's my name. Deeper analysis actually reveals that women made a purposeful choice in how they presented their own stories to the patriarchal state. Thus, petitions can be viewed as an expression of women's agency through the exploitation of their subordinate status in a way that inherently and I think ironically rejects this status. So, what happened to the screen? Did I do something? I can see it here. Touch screen. Oh, I got it, okay, sorry. Somebody wave at me if it does that again. I'm only looking over here. Okay. In her petition, Elizabeth Graham Ferguson claimed that the state state's sale of the estate would serve, quote, at once to destroy the sole support of one who, must she repeat it, will not be found to have deserved evil at their hands. Elizabeth implored the council to relieve her of her insurmountable burdens and benevolently return Graham Park to her so that she might, quote, make such disposition of it as may be necessary for her future support. In closing, she reached out to the council members' sense of obligation to its citizens, and particularly to legal dependents like women in her situation. She implored them to consider her own innocence in the matter of her husband's behavior and forgive her association with him. Quote, she flatters herself their own feelings will never reproach them for the act, and neither heaven nor man grieve at the mercy. As an addendum, Elizabeth included a list of 41 men who could attest both to the legitimacy of her claims and to her position as an object worthy of the council's compassion. Significantly, evidence suggests that Elizabeth played a critical role in the drafting of her petition. The petition itself is the product of several years of edits and amendments, cluttered with strikeouts, crammed with commentary in the margins, as you can see here, all of which supplement and at times contradict the original text. Letters from Andrew Robeson, an attorney and friend of Elizabeth's, reveal at whose direction the markups were made, and in which Robeson wrote to Elizabeth, assuring her that, quote, Mr. Matlack has been waited on and the alterations made agreeably to your desire. Elizabeth's plea, replete with tropes of feminine dependence, was a clear product of her own pen and mind and engaged an artful strategy designed to evoke the sympathy of the legislative body. And this strategy worked. Eventually, Graham Park was returned to Elizabeth's sole ownership. She lived the remainder of her life with a close friend, Eliza Stedman, while publishing some of her poetry in magazines. Due later to financial hardship and declining health, however, she eventually sold the property to her niece's husband in 1795, moved out of Graham Park, and lived close by until her death in February of 1801. I often get asked whether women actually believed what they wrote, whether they bought into the language of their dependence on men. I, too, wondered the same while researching for the book. I would really love to find a source, a kind of letter of one of my subjects writing to a dear friend that she had lied to the legislature, a sort of a, you won't believe what I just wrote in my petition kind of source. Unfortunately, I found none. Many of the women I write about were illiterate or left behind few, if any, written records by their own pen or in their own voice. Elizabeth is kind of an exception in this case. To a certain extent, though, it doesn't matter. What was critical, I think, was that these women made an explicit choice to employ this language attuned to what their audience, the patriarchal state, would want to hear. And in most cases, as with Elizabeth's, it worked. There were those, of course, who did not employ this language. A minority of women petitioners chose instead to chastise either their husbands or the state, in other words, chastising patriarchal authority figures in their lives, and did not provide the requisite supplicating language of dependent femininity. By and large, those petitions were rejected or ignored by the state. I spend so much time on Elizabeth's story here because I think it illustrates the really complex dimensions of women's dependence and women's power in the Revolutionary era that I'd like to break down today. Early American women, like Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, understood the power inherent in their performance of, and to a certain degree, acquiescence to, expectations of feminine comportment. When deployed judiciously, this language convinced men in positions of authority to provide aid, assistance, and especially financial relief to women in distressed situations. Joseph Reed was a delegate in the Continental Congress and president of Pennsylvania at the time. And he wrote to Elizabeth's friend, Anna Stockton, suggesting that Elizabeth was wise to target the fellow feeling of these elite men in her petition. Quote, as to the lady who is the subject of our concern, I hope she and you will do me the justice to believe I sincerely pity and sympathize with her in the misfortunes which have clouded her prospects and embittered her life. My wishes and intentions ever were to soften her calamities to the utmost of my power. Further, Reed insisted that Elizabeth should consider herself fortunate, that the power and ability to relieve her of her distresses were, quote, lodged in the hands of gentlemen of tenderness and consideration, who had a record of showing the most favorable attention to distress like hers. Elizabeth, in other words, was utilizing the most powerful political weapon at her disposal, the petition, and put pen to paper in deploying the most effective language she could muster. American women in the Revolutionary era, like Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, knew well the multifaceted terms of their dependence. Despite enormous legal, social, and economic restrictions, however, early American women were really far from powerless. How is it then that these women with few rights under the law and restricted access to the political sphere were able to express power? During and after the Revolution, women's petitions to what I refer to as the patriarchal state, that is, colonial, revolutionary, and early national institutions, organizations and spaces governed and controlled by elite white men, their petitions during this period increased exponentially. The consequences of the War for American Independence provided both the impetus and the opportunity for women to seek intervention from male authorities in their communities and at the state level. In their increased interactions with the patriarchal state, women employed the very terms of their complex and intersectional dependencies as a strategy to exert agency over their own lives. Significantly, too, the American Revolution provided some women with the language and opportunities with which to claim old rights, that is, the rights of dependence, in new ways. Paradoxically, then, early American women were able to negotiate and argue for a relative degree of power, independence, and rights from the patriarchal state because of and while they existed firmly within this state of dependence. Elizabeth Graham Ferguson, of course, was not the only woman to petition her state government in the Revolutionary era. In my research, I identified thousands of petitions focusing specifically on women in the cities of Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston. I expected to see some significant variation among the petitions of women in these three cities due to cultural, regional, social, and economic differences. Instead, what I found was far more common ground than I anticipated. I looked at primary sources in which women would have been interacting directly with the patriarchal state, that is, petitions to state legislatures, divorce records, marriage settlements, equity cases, probate records, manumission deeds, almshouse books, and charitable institution files. The language across these sources, I think pretty significantly, was very similar and mirrored that of conduct literature and the common law customs of the time. What differed between these three locations was the legal medium through which women sought redress from the government. In other words, it was the law within each jurisdiction itself that made women's experiences differ, though their rhetorical strategies were quite uniform. Take, for example, laws regarding marital separation that governed the laws of women in these three cities. Massachusetts had allowed for divorce for specific reasons, basically from its founding, with Puritans believing that marriage was a civil contract and could therefore be dissolved if broken. Pennsylvania had very limited options for divorce until 1785, when the Revolutionary-era state government liberalized the practice, and South Carolina did not allow for divorce until at least the Reconstruction era, though that was, like many Reconstruction-era policies, short-lived. So I looked at divorce suits filed by women in Boston and Philadelphia and found sources somewhat comparable in South Carolina, known as femme-sole trader deeds, and I'll talk more about those in a moment. So women in Boston really took seriously the expectation that their marriages were a contractual agreement. Their petitions to the Suffolk County Court demonstrate as much. Massachusetts wives offered up the various ways in which they themselves had held steadfast to these marital covenants, being obedient, submissive wives who acquiesced to their husband's authority, while their husbands in turn violated the social, economic, and legal obligations to their dependent spouses. Philadelphia women did not inherit the cultural expectation of marriage being a civil contract like their Boston counterparts did, but Pennsylvania's newly expanded statutes regarding divorce gave women new opportunities for seeking marital separation from, for example, husbands who had deserted them years before. Like their contemporaries in Boston, though, Philadelphia women also emphasized that they had performed dutifully their subordinate gender roles within their marriages. And in these cases, women gained a degree of independence by emphasizing their dependence on men. Women in Charleston, as I said, could not seek such redress within their marriages, but they did have mechanisms for claiming financial independence, that is, a form of femme-sole status while still remaining married, or femme covert. Femme-sole trader status gave married women the right to conduct business and sign contracts, in other words, maintain an independent legal identity. Excuse me. The law required their husbands to consent to the arrangement, which they did in formal documents submitted to the General Assembly. Oftentimes, these men acquiesced that their wives were better financial providers than they themselves were. In this way, Charleston women could gain financial independence from husbands, all while remaining dependent on them in other ways. The legal structure then was really integral in framing women's dependence and their ability to express power over their own lives. Laws are, to quote historian Laura Edwards, the aspiration of lawmakers, the vision of the kind of society they want to create, the social order they wish to enforce. But laws are also what people make them. Petitions as sources provide clues of women's lived experience when the historical record is otherwise silent. They show us the ways in which women conform to the law and social custom, but also the ways in which they made the law their own. Rather than seeing the law's power as absolute or rendering women's resistance exceptional, I'd argue that we need to rethink ideas of dependence, power, and even the law to recognize the fullness of women's experiences through their exploitation of this confining system. So let me provide another example here. A Bostonian woman by the name of Freelove Scott, and yes, that is her real name, was able to successfully manipulate the law to work to her advantage, all while exploiting tropes of feminine dependence in her several petitions to the Massachusetts Assembly. Her husband, Joseph, had left Boston when the British occupation ended in March of 1776, and under the Confiscation Act, his property was then under control of the Massachusetts state government. She and her children, however, remained in the city. Freelove's petition mirrored that of many other women, including Elizabeth Graham Ferguson. In it, she crafted a sympathetic narrative intent on evoking paternalist sentimentality from the legislative body. She sought the compassion of your honors, pleas, for the distresses of an unfortunate mother who has the care of 5 children without money to support them or the means of procuring it. She predicted that her family, without her husband present, would suffer certain poverty and destitution, asking that she and the children be able to live in their home rent-free until the Assembly rectified the unfortunate confiscation of her husband's property. Here, Freelove was looking to have the Assembly bend the law in her favor. Never once did she contest her husband's politics. Instead, she admitted to them, but argued that her children should not be made to suffer for the faults of their father. Consistently, she distanced herself from her husband's politics and often rebuked it, a tenuous line for a woman to toe in the Revolutionary era. Temporarily, at least, the body agreed to her requests. She paid no rent to remain in her home with her children, at least until the Assembly decreed any further resolves. Her next petition, however, was a bit more pointed. With her husband out of the country and she and her children still dependents, Freelove claimed a certain amount of protection in that dependence, which she believed was now owed to her by the state itself. Effectively, with her domestic patriarch, her husband, the father of her children, no longer able to provide for them, she argued that the state itself ought to step in as a surrogate for that role. She repeated the sympathetic narrative, her helpless situation, paying the required lip service to her subordinate role. Yet portions of her petition were decidedly less deferential. Freelove wrote that she presumed her situation would have entitled her to such a share of commiseration as to have produced a suitable support for herself and family out of her husband's effects. Here, then, she simultaneously asserted her dependence and used that dependence to make demands of the government, which she believed had failed to fulfill its patriarchal role, just as her husband had implicitly failed to do so. Likewise, this second plea was also replete with somewhat subtle accusations of the legislature's lack of sympathy for her plight. She accused the Assembly, for example, of only granting her £150 in relief funds, which is no small amount at this time. Significantly, in response, the state offered a unique solution that ran counter to legal precedent at the time. Freelove Scott, the Assembly ordered, was to be granted 1/3 of her husband's estate, the equivalent to her dower right. Dower was essentially a right reserved to widows, who, upon the death of their husbands, would inherit at least 1/3 of all property, real and personal, that had belonged to their spouses during their lifetime. So what the legislature did here was to effectively declare her husband legally dead in such a way that she was a widow by law and entitled to the rights therein. Significantly, too, the Assembly used Freelove's case as a new precedent. The body became empowered to settle with any of the absentee wives remaining in the state and who have not quitted it to join the enemies of the United States of America. Freelove Scott here seized an opportunity to better position herself and her children financially, but in the process, her petitioning had the added effect of bending the law for women in similar situations. So I think we need to consider the law itself as a less rigid construct, but I'd also like to suggest that we challenge typical understandings of both dependence and power. So dependence was a fact of life in colonial British America, defining relationships ranging from colonial subjects' connections to the king to wives' unions with their husbands. Both parties in this relationship had power, even dependence, and these relationships required a set of mutual obligations. Thus, dependence was not considered an inherently impotent status. The meaning of dependence shifted, however, with the adoption of the Declaration of Independence. Dependence ceased to be a construct with positive connotations in the American imagination and likewise became imbued with a sense of powerlessness, and it was deeply gendered as well. The newly independent United States required the allegiance of its people and adopted the concept of voluntary citizenship rather than involuntary subjectship. Accordingly, the law recognized women's personhood and, to a certain degree, their citizenship, but it also presumed their dependence, which codified them as legally vulnerable and passive. Dependence then became highly gendered and feminized. Women's dependent status was likewise contingent on their socioeconomic status, their race, the legal jurisdiction in which they resided, and especially their relationship to men in power. So importantly, and pardon my lack of graphic skills here, dependence must not be observed as the ultimate foil to independence, kind of binary, but these terms really need to be considered as existing on a fluid spectrum. And the spectrum of dependence, of course, is deeply hierarchical. So let me provide another example of a woman named Jane. On January 19th, 1779, a free black man named Carolina Lamble attested to his purchase and subsequent manumission of an enslaved woman named Jane. Most manumission deeds were submitted to the state by very wealthy white Americans who had the economic power to claim ownership over other human beings, so Lamble's race already stands out from the rest of the source base. Lamble testified that the amount Jane paid him for her freedom, was a mere 20 shillings. Such a sum seems puzzling when juxtaposed with hundreds of other deeds in which enslaved people were often sold for hundreds or even thousands of pounds. Lamble, however, was not concerned with Jane's monetary value as human property. Instead, he offered as his motivation for manumission the love and affection he possessed for Jane as her husband. Lamble purchased his wife from an enslaver named Rachel Caw and used his power as a free man to liberate his wife from the institution of slavery. Because I've been focusing on the importance of the rhetoric in these legal documents, I'll highlight one phrase that I think is especially notable within Jane Lamble's emancipation deed. With the stroke of a pen, as he made his mark on the binding legal document, Carolina Lamble declared that his wife Jane should henceforth be legally entitled to have and to hold herself. Lamble's diction here is significant. Rather than present the South Carolina Secretary of State with the same rote language employed by the white men and women whose business it was to trade in human beings, Lamble and Jane chose their own words. As a result of their union, of their love, Jane would have ownership over herself. Jane and Carolina Lamble's future children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, all generations that followed would enjoy the same, all descending from a free female line. At the same time, however, the patriarchal state dictated the process by which Lamble and Jane were to work together to seize her freedom and that of her future children. Seeking to legitimate Jane's freedom under the law, Lamble purchased his wife and therefore, albeit briefly, owned her. In these moments, Jane was legally enslaved property belonging to her own husband. It was this intermediary point between slavery and freedom, a very brief moment on the spectrum, that the two facilitated together. It was temporary, it was a means to an end and a kind of technicality, but it was also a necessary step to ensure Jane's freedom in the eyes of the patriarchal state and in accordance with the law. Black women's relationship to freedom, independence, and the patriarchal state is, of course, fraught with contradictions. You may have noticed, too, that I did not mention Jane or Carolina Lamble's petition for the former's freedom. Instead, I referred to a deed of manumission, a legal document required by the state of South Carolina to recognize officially the freedom of formerly enslaved African Americans. Petitions submitted to state legislatures and courts by Black women across the period were very few and far between. But in the same way that I'm asking you to reconsider our understandings of dependence and power, I'd like us to also broaden our understanding of what constitutes petitioning in the petitioning process. In order to truly analyze how Black women navigated the confining socio-legal systems created by the patriarchal state, we must likewise look beyond the traditional legal archive and consider the voices and actions of Black women in both slavery's archive and in freedom's archive. In the lives of enslaved women, for example, the patriarchal state was personified in the figure of an enslaving patriarch, or in some cases, enslaving female patriarch, to borrow Lori Glover's terminology, to whom the institutional state granted and extended its powers. Deeds of emancipation, which are often written by enslavers, can uncover the otherwise invisible anti-slavery activism of those people, including women who were held in bondage. Legal sources like Deeds of Emancipation then provide evidence of a different kind of Black women's petitioning efforts. These important sources reveal that gendered familial roles circumscribe the ways in which Black women navigated their legal status in the Revolutionary era. As was the case with Carolina Lamble and his wife Jane, Black men and women often worked together in their quest for freedom. Black husbands and fathers performed the role of protector and provider for their wives and children in really exceptional ways, especially relative to what we see white husbands and fathers doing for their families. Likewise, Black women fulfilled wifely and motherly duty in their interactions with the patriarchal state, despite the legal, economic, and social limitations imposed on them by their racial identity and status of enslavement. Significantly, Black women's capacity to grant freedom or unfreedom to their children was literally embodied within them. The laws of colonial Virginia outlined this most explicitly in 1662, eschewing the Anglo-American concepts of patrilineality and instead establishing that an enslaved mother's status determined the status of her children. Because of this doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum, a child's legal status of freedom or slavery would follow that of their mother at birth. Numerous scholars have analyzed the ways in which Black women's reproductive capacity bolstered the white patriarchal state by facilitating the natural increase of the enslaved population, both institutionally and literally, as numerous enslavers assaulted enslaved women and subsequently held their own biological children in slavery. Certainly this was the case under most circumstances, but the doctrine of partus sequitur ventrum requires a bit more nuanced analysis. By the same framework of law, Black women's bodies could also grant freedom to their children and, importantly, to subsequent generations of free Black Americans, as you can see in the Emancipation Deed here. The stakes of Black women's efforts in testing and exploiting the boundaries of patriarchal power, therefore, were much higher than those of white women. The latter petitioned the state in the Revolutionary era for relief and assistance because of the upheavals of war and daily life, on certain occasions doing so as a matter of survival. Regardless of the intent or need of these white women petitioners, these rhetorical strategies reinforced white patriarchs' expectations of dependent women's behavior and attitudes. Free and enslaved Black women, on the other hand, resisted the patriarchal state in a much more explicit way, seeking to free themselves and their progeny from enslavement forever, performing the utmost measure of devoted motherhood. Yet, notably, they too conformed to the terms of patriarchal law to codify that freedom out of extreme necessity. In numerous ways, the patriarchal state in its various forms did not live up to the protections it promised its dependents. In these cases, women often took matters into their own hands, relying on each other and compelling the state's compliance through the collective support of women's networks. I'd like to argue then that women's interdependence, fancy graphics, their reliance on one another was a critical component of their ability to survive in the Revolutionary era, despite the patriarchal state's legal, economic, and social restrictions that was meant to inhibit their power and agency. Women built, sustained, and depended upon female networks of interdependence when the mechanisms of protection within the patriarchal state failed them. Women relied on female family members and friends across North America and even throughout the Atlantic world, but also in their neighborhoods, bypassing or explicitly challenging male authority in the process. Women's communal and familial networks enabled them to critique men and the patriarchal state in an effort to protect the women in their lives, in some ways usurping the role of the male protector and expressly undermining women's dependence. The historical record is really filled with examples of the ways in which women came to each other's aid and defense, especially when patriarchal figures, their spouses or the state, failed to provide adequate support or protection for these women. They shared rhetorical strategies in writing petitions, and in some cases, they petitioned the state together or wrote petitions on behalf of their female friends and family members. Most notably, and I think most interestingly, and I'm happy to talk about these in the Q&A period, evidence in depositions from divorce suits indicate that women more readily provided witness testimony in support of other women than did men. In a number of cases, too, women physically intervened to protect their neighbors and female family members from domestic violence, and in at least one occasion, saving their lives in the process. Notably, too, I should say, these depositions reveal men's reluctance to step between a husband and wife in these disputes. This interdependence proved a critical failsafe when the patriarchal state and household patriarchs proved inadequate protectors and providers. In the places I studied, really densely populated urban areas, the proximity of female friends and neighbors provided women with local networks that supported and in some cases saved them. Like dependence and independence, sorry to be overusing this, I think we need to think about power and expressions of power as existing on a spectrum as well. While a traditional understanding of power implies some form of domination of one party over another through possession, control, command, or authority, this conception obscures the meaning of the word itself while also negating the exercises and expressions of power that do not conform to these standards. If power is also understood as existing on a fluid spectrum, then analysis of women's invocation of the language of dependence in their petitions to state legislatures, courts, local aid societies, and their communities becomes much different. The notion that women could and can still express power because of their subordinate status and the protection it offers indicates that women have never been completely powerless. Like other historically marginalized groups or individuals, women have been able to express a degree of power, autonomy, and agency over their own lives while still being overtly suppressed by a controlling authority. Thus, dependence expressed power in a variety of ways, including more subtle means such as claiming a public voice or becoming politically active through the submission of petitions. What's especially significant, however, is not that women found power through petitioning various authorities, but that they found power in this way through public declarations of their dependent, unequal, and subordinate status. While this strategy was certainly effective in remedying women's individual problems, I argue that it may have simultaneously delayed and restricted women's ability to collectively organize and push for the rights and freedoms that eluded them during and in the wake of the American Revolution. Ironically, when women engaged with, employed, and exploited the terms of their dependence as a strategy for survival, advancement, and empowerment, the unintended result of that method was to perpetuate their inequality. Without collective action, with only short-term resistance to individual abuses in particular situations for very specific women, the system of oppression, this white patriarchal power structure, is able to flourish. Patriarchy thrives when the problem identified, as was the case in these petitions, was individual men who did not conform to the system. When women identified singular abusive husbands, negligent providers, or derelict male leaders as the obstacle to their safety and survival, these men appeared as aberrant cogs in an otherwise functional machine. The real problem, however, was a hierarchical structure crafted according to deficient and erroneous presumptions that could only ever truly protect those already in power. Guaranteed protection for dependents was and is merely a veneer to hide the failures of a flawed system that can never live up to its promises. Most women in the Revolutionary era did not have the time, capacity, or even the inclination to pursue collective action to fight against the oppressive forces of the patriarchal state. Their tacit acceptance of their own unequal status was motivated by the need to survive, in most cases, the urgency of managing the consequences of men's choices in war, in politics, and under the law, among other things. In this system, they did not or could not prioritize countering the suppression of their sex by men, instead pursuing the more feasible goal of expressing agency and power over their own individual lives. This all underscores the need to redefine and thus, in the process, reclaim women's political power throughout history. We have to conduct our historical analyses based on what was possible and not project our 21st century expectations on those who lived in a patriarchal society exponentially more confining and limiting than our own. Take, for example, the case of women's rights. No, the American Revolution and the founding of a new nation purportedly on the basis of equality for all did not bring these ideas to fruition. Women did not, for example, claim the legal right to suffrage until at least 1920, and for most marginalized women, long after that. But that does not mean that there was not a shift in women's rights during the Revolutionary era. The most notable trend I discovered in my research was that women, in petitioning the government, began to demand aid and assistance from the state as a right, beginning in the early to mid 1770s, using that language explicitly. This right existed on the basis of their dependence on men. The revolution did not grant them this additional right, it already existed, yet it's critical that ordinary women would start to recognize themselves as rights-bearing individuals. This was a necessary step in raising their consciousness as citizens, ultimately, eventually, believing that they deserved full equality under the law. Even for those women who sought to remedy only the injustices of their own statuses, their individual persistence created significant cracks in the foundation of the patriarchal system. Power is not always a matter of tearing down walls and breaking through barriers. It's not always loud, visible, or paradigm shifting. It's often slight and subtle, quiet or silent, careful not to disturb the vast machinations of subjugation against which it resists in order to make small but meaningful gains. Power, in many cases, is evidenced by the persistence amid deep and structural disadvantage built into systemic discrimination and oppression. That persistence is the through line among all instances of the fight for rights, freedom, and independence in American history. Thank you.
Okay, so now we're going to open up for Q&A.
Thank you so much. So I have a quick question,
Yeah.
and I'm curious about the concept of societal and governmental obligation to dependence that you mentioned, particularly in relation to the self-liberation of women. If they were unable to utilize the petitioning process, what other options would they have to act upon themselves to reclaim their rights? So,
Via the state?
Right.
Very little. Really, the petitioning process, I mean, I think when we think about it today, it's like, you know, an online page that you type your name to sign a petition. This is a much more individualistic process, and it's the way that people without formal rights in these societies could, you know, claim some measure of protection from the state. So I think the only other way to do that would be to kind of go directly to the legislature or the court and request some kind of assistance, but that's effectively what the petition was. Some of these petitions were given orally, and the clerk of the court would kind of record them. Some of them were submitted through lawyers or other mechanisms, but it was really the only legal mechanism that marginalized people had in society. And I should say, it's not just something that women do, it's something that everybody does, but the language is very gendered. You know, the petition itself is a document that requires a certain level of deference to authority. So even men who are petitioning the state have to kind of perform that deference, but they do so in a way very different from women, and it mostly correlates to you know, how men were expected to behave. So I will say there are a couple of instances that I looked at where I forget the name of the man, Nathaniel something, outside Boston. He was petitioning the assembly in Massachusetts for compensation because I think it was the local militia or somebody, my military history is abysmal, sorry, but they had basically trampled through their land and taken some of their livestock. So he was looking for compensation for that from the state, and they basically ignored him. And then his wife did the same petition with her own kind of rote language, I think a couple of years later, and they gave her money. So I think in a lot of ways, women are able to paint themselves as this kind of sympathetic, helpless figure in a much more convincing way than a lot of men can. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this. I'm curious if you could say a bit about the analysis that you did of these thousands of petitions that shows the causal takeaway that you're arguing here.
Mm-hmm.
So as I understand it, what you're saying is that because there was these shared norms, rhetorical norms, the shared sort of discourse of patriarchy, these women could individually leverage these expectations strategically through a rhetoric of supplication in order to enhance their material
Yes.
And that's a kind of autonomy of power, and that makes total sense as a story. But how do you know across these thousands of petitions that it's the presence or absence of the rhetoric in the petition that's doing this work causally and controlling for lots of other variables?
Yeah.
For example, I could imagine geographical differences, status differences with structure of the institution. Is it a court versus a legislature? What kind of legislature?
Yeah.
So how do you substantiate the causal dimension of
Yeah,
this?
I have a pretty massive Excel sheet that tracks all of these, and the transcriptions in like Evernote or something. But the basic Excel sheet is the metadata like petitioner, date, location, just kind of very briefly what they're asking for in the petition and whether it was rejected, accepted, or kind of there's a question mark. Sometimes it's like, oh, we're going to table this discussion and we'll talk about it tomorrow. And then I go to the page for tomorrow and there's nothing. And I keep going and keep going and there's nothing. So I think it's kind of like a pocket veto where we don't know. But I think most women use these strategies, right? And they talk to each other about it. There's a really great source or set of sources where I think it was 2 women seeking divorces in Boston. And the first woman petitions the court for a divorce and it's not granted. The second woman petitions and it is. And then the first woman comes back and she's like, you know what? My friend just got a divorce from you guys and my situation is much worse than hers. So, and then she gets her divorce at that point. So they really do talk to each other. In terms of knowing whether this is part of the causation, just kind of comparing the women who do use this rhetoric and the women who don't. It's a smaller percentage of the women who don't. It's pretty clear that has at least a significant effect, if not being totally causal. There are situations where, like Free Love Scott, she does criticize her husband, which is like, no, you shouldn't be doing that. But she comes to the defense of the state and she doesn't try to explain away her husband's politics. So women who were going to chastise their husbands had to show deference to the patriarchal state. Women who were going to criticize the state had to show deference to their husbands. But there's also a kind of practical consideration here where if women were going to kind of pay lip service to this notion, the state also didn't want them to become dependent on the state, right, on the public dole. So there was a motivation there, I think, for the women who critique the state and who the state knows they have other options, like they could go to Canada, they could go to England. They're like, no, we're not dealing with this. And especially if the husband's loyalism was particularly egregious in their minds and they couldn't, metaphorically divorce the wives from those politics.
So, but how do you avoid confirmation bias here? Like just in the sense of, it's a compelling story, but really testing the likelihood in some way that if one of these petitioners uses this rhetoric, that it's actually the rhetoric that's doing the work.
Yeah, we can't know for sure because the legislatures send these petitions to committees. We all have our subcommittees, right? So those committees discuss the source, but their minutes don't include like what our logic is most of the time. Sometimes they do. Right, and sometimes they will say she is an object deserving of our support, right? And they use that kind of language. I borrowed this idea of fellow feeling from Nicole Eustace's Emotional History of the Revolution. She has a whole chapter talking about how elite white leaders had this sense of, they justified their position because they could elicit sympathy towards their, those below them in the hierarchy. So the fact that, and it's kind of part of this 18th century culture of deference as well, they do make notes that this woman is worthy for XYZ reason in some of their notations, but not all of them. So, it's my best guess and it's all I have, but I do know that this was specifically a choice that women made in a lot of these cases, and they're talking to each other about this. So I imagine that even petitions we've lost, there's not a ton of detail outside of these forms. And like I said, most of these women don't leave letters or diaries or things. Elizabeth Graham is very unique in that way, but she was pretty pointed in saying, it has to say this, right? And she knew Joseph Reed, and Joseph Reed was not a fan of hers because what her husband was doing and trying to like elicit bribery with the Continental Army and all of these things. She was kind of persona non grata, but you know, Reed and then Robeson both say like, you know, this was a good strategy because Reed's like, you know, she's so lucky that we take into account the distressing situation of people like her, right, in a very patronizing way. But so I would really love to know what they actually think about this, if these women are like, ugh, pulled one over on these guys, or, you know. But again, it's not necessarily material to the question because they knew it was effective.
Just one last thing, and I promise I'll shut up. It just seems like you could do a pretty straightforward analysis here, maybe in a future project or something, or a graduate student, where you just
someone else can do that.
Yeah, if you could. Well, but if you could correlate outcomes, right, which you can code pretty easily, yes, no, and then we know null ones that we don't know, with the presence or absence of this rhetoric.
No, I mean, I do
You
that.
do
Yeah,
that.
so it's,
Oh.
I have some graphs in the book, I think.
Okay.
Also made in Excel, very
guess that's
professional.
what I
But,
was
but yeah, no, so that's, I want to say it's like the 5th chapter of the book. I talk about the ways in which this does not work. So it's especially for poor laboring women who have this double bind of their gender and their class, so they have to kind of work to earn that support in a way that middling and elite women do not in their petitions, and they're relying on the almshouses. There's a kind of charitable institution in Philadelphia called the Magdalene Society that is interested in reforming fallen women, and they have to jump through hoops to get that kind of relief and often leave as soon as they can. But I also talk about women who explicitly went after the state, and they did not follow this formula, and they were either ignored or rejected. I think Free Love Scott and maybe one other are exceptions, but again, she's kind of couching it as like, my husband was wrong, like you guys are right, can I please have my property back now, please?
Hi.
We've met before.
We have met
Yes.
before, yes.
Okay.
Great to see
Lauren,
you.
right?
Yeah,
Yes, okay,
great
cool.
to see you. This is wonderful. Really enjoyed the presentation, and thanks to you for being here and to the students for organizing this. This is really killer. I'm going to adapt a question that I once heard Kellen Henneford ask, so citing my source here, which is just, what is the utility? Where does it kind of work and where does it doesn't work? This kind of coinage that I heard a lot in this presentation, early American women.
Yeah.
As we know, just women, the kind of constructions of gender it deploy so systematically along lines of race and class that the kind of, the good wife moniker that you start with, I imagine it was mostly referring to white women. The kind of constructions of black women, and enslaved black women, and of course the intersection of the two are just so different of like what the gendered constructions mean of them. And so, obviously like the term, women in general like has some meaning, but like in your work, how do you think about it? Of where, like, when do we use this term as a kind of monolithic, homogenous category, early American women, and when do we not?
Yeah, so you mean kind of without the distinctions of race and class, or me making presumptions about early Americans' gender identities?
I was referring to more the former of just like, how, like, basically like, how possible is it to talk about early American women often as a category, as opposed to saying white women, elite white women, poor white women, poor black women, and then of course the intersections among these.
Yes.
How much should we be using that one term?
Yeah, it's hard because after a while you're saying elite white women, elite white women, elite white women. It becomes kind of redundant and like not the best writing. But yeah, for the most part, I think early in the book, I talk about how most of the women in these petitions are white, right? I think I was telling this to the undergrads this morning, or maybe at lunch, that when I went through my first sweep of sources when I was doing this work as my dissertation, I just like very naively was like, I'll find women of color in the source base. There was maybe, I can count on one hand how many of the thousands were submitted by black women, and there was only one court case that I found that involved an indigenous woman. So I was like, all right, well, when we work on the book, we have to be a little bit more deliberate about what sources we're looking at, which is why I started looking at these manumission deeds, and even so, looking at the almshouse records and these charitable institution files, right? Thinking about the ways in which women's intersectional identities impact their ability to use the terms of their dependence, right? So certainly the women that are most successful are the elite white women who are connected to elite white men, right? Their connections to other men in power, and it's like, he knows this guy in the legislature and that's gonna help, or, this is a surname that they recognize. So that makes a difference. It's who you know, and it's your level of kind of familial economic power. But anybody could submit a petition, right? And certainly if it's, a middling or even a laboring woman who, there's a bunch of women in Boston who kind of petition to be able to run a tavern or something like that, and it's kind of separate from the revolution. And while I think Boston was trying to limit the number of taverns in the city, a lot of times they granted these deeds to women who were like, you know what, my husband died and I have like these children to take care of. I really need this as a way of support. And the state is kind of like, good, we don't want to support you. If you can do that on your own, great. So it's very tricky, and it's more so like, okay, when I'm giving a talk, in order to squish down the words, we're just going to say women. But I think I was out at Davis last year talking to graduate students about the book. And Ellen Hartigan O'Connor asked about categorizing women in this way. And I'm like, yeah, this is the way that I chose which stories to represent and who counts as a woman is basically how the state would decide to count someone as a woman, right, in order to be consistent. And there's problems too in the archive. I write about this. I have a note on the limitations of the sources in the book. And when I was at the State Archives in Boston, I could not kind of systematically find all the cases that involve Black and Indigenous women because of the way that the archive is organized, right? It would take, I don't even know how long, but it's thousands of reels, well, not thousands of reels, but lots of reels of microfilm, right, over however many years. The divorce records were easy because it's like Smith v. Smith. Great, I know that one's a divorce and I can get that pretty quickly. But otherwise, it's looking through the indices in all of these judicial records. And whenever the clerk in his kind of arbitrary decision wrote down, blah-de-blah, slave of, or blah-de-blah, comma, Indian, then I would go to that source because I knew. But otherwise, it's just names. And there was no consistency, as far as I can tell, for a clerk identifying people of color in their records. It was just however he decided to label it that day. So I'm sure there's more out there. That's a project for those of you who need one. But again, it's really limited to the way the archives are organized. I have much better data from South Carolina because I can see the metadata of the sources, whereas in Massachusetts, they're just on endless reels of microfilm and just would take infinite amount of time just rolling through. So yeah, it would be a great project if you want to take a couple of years and do that, go for it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
This is going to be our last question, so.
Oh, I'll be around after if you guys want to ask questions.
Hi, thank you so much. I have, way in the back, really enjoyed the talk. So kind of going off of the last question on intersectional identities, I was really curious about that small part when you talked about these networks of women empowering other women as a feminist. I love that. And I was just curious if you have found any records of these networks of women that cross racial and economic boundaries, of white and Black women working together, of poor and rich women working together, especially enslaved women and enslavers. I know that's probably improbable.
Yeah, no, the only thing I can think of is that of the emancipation deeds I looked at, some of the enslavers were white women. And I don't know if we can give them a whole lot of credit for assenting to the freedom of enslaved women, but if you want to call that working together, I guess you could. No, I think what I alluded to in my talk divorce cases that included depositions, which is where you really get into the meat of what's going on in these people's lives. so compelling. But especially in these urban areas, you know, people are living in really close proximity, and when there's some kind of domestic dispute with their neighbors, they hear about it. They can literally hear it, as well as hearing the kind of gossip mill. So I guess, and this is kind of hard to discern, but I think for the most part, those women tend to be of the same socioeconomic status, and they're all white. I had one case of divorce that involved a black woman, but that's it. But yeah, there were literally instances in which you know, women in their depositions would talk about like stepping in between a husband as he is abusing his wife and like taking that upon themselves. And there's a couple of cases where husbands and wives were both, you know, neighbors. The husband and wife were both witnesses in these depositions, and the women would just go off like, he's terrible, he's a drunk, he's beating her all the time, there's no reason for it, she's so lovely, blah, blah, blah. I've had to stop him a million times. And the husband's like, I don't really know if anything was going on. I just what. And so it's clear that the kind of gendered support cuts both ways, that men are not really willing to challenge their neighbors or their brothers or whatever patriarchal authority in the home, but women and their kind of empathy and understanding what that experience is like are happy to have that time in court where the law takes them seriously and their opinion is valued. So yeah. But yeah, to answer your question, mostly no.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, Jacqueline, thank you again so much for coming to talk to us today. And thank you all for being here. We really appreciate it. Two quick things. If you guys are signed up for the Shakespeare's dinner, the undergraduates, we're going to leave like 5:15, 5:30. We'll have a group heading there. And then we'd love to have you join us for our Pursuit of Happiness Hour, which will take place right after hereafter. We've got so much food. So yeah, thank you again.
Also, I don't have books, but if you want to buy it, just send me an email and I'll send you a signed book plate. It'll be out in paperback in the fall. Hooray.